Madison Cross checked her watch for the third time in 10 minutes. The flight from Chicago had been delayed. Her luggage was somewhere between Denver and Montana, and now her rental car was making a noise that sounded like a dying cat. She gripped the steering wheel tighter and pressed the gas pedal, hoping to reach Cedar Ridge before the sun disappeared completely behind the mountains. The GPS on her phone showed nothing but a blank screen with the words "No service" mocking her from the dashboard. She'd been driving on this dusty back road for what felt like hours, passing nothing but endless fields and the occasional cow staring at her with what looked suspiciously like judgment. Madison had handled billion-dollar mergers, faced down intimidating CEOs, and never lost a case in her 8-year career. But right now, surrounded by more open space than she'd ever seen in her life, she felt completely out of her element. The city girl in her designer heels and perfectly pressed suit was definitely not built for this kind of adventure. The car made another horrible grinding noise, followed by a series of clicks that didn't sound promising at all. Steam started rising from under the hood, and Madison knew her day was about to get much worse. She pulled over to the side of the dirt road, got out, and stared at the car like she could fix it through sheer willpower. "Come on," she muttered, popping the hood and immediately regretting it as a cloud of hot steam hit her face. She knew absolutely nothing about cars beyond putting gas in them and occasionally checking the oil. The engine looked like a complicated puzzle she had no hope of solving. She tried her phone again, holding it up toward the sky like some kind of offering to the technology gods. Still no signal. The sun was getting lower, and she was starting to realize that her carefully planned schedule was completely ruined. She had a meeting with the ranch owner first thing in the morning, and showing up looking like she'd been wrestling with farm equipment wasn't exactly the professional image she needed to maintain. Madison was just starting to consider her options when she heard the rumble of an approaching vehicle. A dusty pickup truck came around the bend, slowing down when the driver spotted her stranded car. The truck pulled over, and Madison felt a mix of relief and wariness. She'd heard enough stories about isolated roads and strangers to be cautious, but right now she didn't have many choices. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man who looked like he'd walked straight out of a Western movie. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing faded jeans and a work shirt that had seen better days. His boots were scuffed and practical, not the fancy kind city people wore to look fashionable. A worn cowboy hat sat comfortably on his head, and when he looked at her, she noticed his eyes were the color of coffee and seemed to hold just a hint of amusement. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight drawl that suggested he'd lived in this part of the world his entire life. There was something easy and confident about the way he moved, like he belonged in this landscape of endless sky and rolling hills. "Obviously," Madison replied, her tone sharper than she'd intended. She was tired, frustrated, and not in the mood for small talk with some local farmer. The engine just started smoking and making terrible noises. The man walked over to her car and peered under the hood, seemingly unbothered by her attitude. "Looks like your radiator's overheated, probably a busted hose. You're lucky it didn't seize up completely." He straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag he'd pulled from his pocket. "I'm Jake, by the way." "Jake Sullivan." Madison hesitated for a moment. She wasn't in the habit of introducing herself to strangers on random roads, but this Jake person seemed harmless enough, and she was clearly going to need his help. "Madison Cross, I'm a lawyer from Chicago." "Long way from home," Jake observed, glancing at her expensive car and equally expensive outfit. "What brings a city lawyer to our little corner of nowhere?" "Business," Madison said curtly. She wasn't about to explain her mission to some random cowboy, especially since there was a good chance he knew the people she was here to deal with. Small towns had a way of making everyone's business everyone else's business. Jake nodded like he understood she didn't want to talk about it. "Well, your car's not going anywhere tonight. I can give you a ride into town if you want. There's a decent motel, and Tommy's garage can probably fix this up for you tomorrow." Madison looked around at the empty landscape stretching in all directions. The alternative was spending the night in her car, which didn't seem like a particularly appealing option. "I suppose I don't have much choice." Not unless you want to walk about 15 miles in those shoes, Jake said, glancing down at her heels with what might have been a smirk. She followed him to his truck, trying not to notice how he moved with the kind of easy confidence that came from physical work and an outdoor life. The truck was old but well-maintained, and when Jake opened the passenger door for her, she caught a whiff of leather, hay, and something clean and masculine that was definitely not cologne. As they drove toward town, Jake tried to make conversation. "So, what kind of law do you practice in Chicago?" "Corporate acquisitions," Madison answered, staring out the window at the passing scenery. Everything looked the same to her: fields, fences, more fields, the occasional farmhouse in the distance. "Sounds complicated." "It's not that complicated when you know what you're doing." She turned to look at him. "What about you?" "Let me guess, you're a rancher, third generation," Jake confirmed. "My grandfather started the Broken Arrow back in the 50s. My dad expanded it, and now it's my turn to figure out how to keep it going." Something in his voice made Madison glance at him more carefully. There was a weight to his words, like keeping the ranch going wasn't as simple as it sounded. But before she could think about it too much, they crested a hill and she got her first view of Cedar Ridge. The town was smaller than she'd expected. Just a main street with a handful of businesses, a few residential streets branching off like fingers, and mountains rising up on all sides like protective walls. It looked like the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's name, where people still left their doors unlocked and neighbors helped each other without being asked. It was exactly the kind of place Madison had spent her entire adult life trying to escape. Jake pulled up in front of a modest building with a neon sign that read Cedar Ridge Motel. The place looked clean enough, though it was clearly more functional than fancy. "This is your best bet for tonight. Rita runs a decent place, and she makes the best coffee in 3 counties. Madison got out of the truck and retrieved her briefcase from the back seat. "Thank you for the ride. I'll figure out how to get back to my car tomorrow." "I can pick you up in the morning if you want," Jake offered. "Tommy's garage is right next to my place, so it's not out of the way." She studied his face, trying to figure out his angle. In her experience, people didn't help strangers without wanting something in return. "Why would you do that?" Jake shrugged. "It's what people do around here. Help their neighbors." "I'm not your neighbor. I'm just passing through." "Everyone's a neighbor when they need help," he said simply, and something about the way he said it made Madison feel like she was missing something important. She watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing into the gathering dusk, and realized she hadn't even asked him how to contact him in the morning. In the city, that would have been a major problem. Here, she had a feeling it wouldn't matter. In a town this small, finding Jake Sullivan probably wouldn't be too difficult. As she walked into the motel lobby, Madison had no idea that the man who just rescued her from the side of the road was the same person she'd come to Cedar Ridge to destroy. Tomorrow, she would discover that Jake Sullivan owned the Broken Arrow Ranch, the property her client desperately needed for their development project. Tomorrow, she would have to look him in the eye and explain exactly how she planned to take away everything his family had built over 3 generations. But tonight, she was just a stranded city girl who'd been helped by a kind stranger, and she was trying very hard not to think about why that simple act of kindness felt like something she'd been missing her whole life. Madison woke up the next morning feeling like she'd slept on a rock. The motel bed wasn't terrible, but it was nothing like her memory foam mattress back in Chicago. She'd spent half the night thinking about her presentation and the other half wondering why she couldn't stop picturing Jake's easy smile and the way he'd helped her. Without asking for anything in return, she showered quickly and put on her best power suit, navy blue. Perfectly tailored, the kind that made opposing lawyers nervous in courtrooms. Today was going to be all business, and she needed to look the part. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed exactly what she wanted to see: professional, confident, and completely in control. Retta, the motel owner, had left coffee and homemade muffins in the lobby with a note saying to help herself. The coffee was actually amazing, much better than the expensive stuff from her usual Chicago coffee shop. Madison grabbed a travel cup and headed outside. expecting to figure out how to get back to her car. Jake was already there, leaning against his truck with his arms crossed, looking like he'd been up for hours. He probably had been. She'd heard somewhere that farmers got up before dawn. He was wearing clean jeans and a button-down shirt that looked like he'd made an effort, though. His boots were still the same scuffed work boots from yesterday. "Morning," he said, straightening up when he saw her. "Sleep, okay? Fine, thank you." Madison tried to keep her voice professional, but something about seeing him again made her stomach do a little flip. She ignored it completely. "I appreciate you coming to get me." "No problem. Tommy's already looking at your car. Should have it ready by this afternoon." They drove to the garage in comfortable silence, and Madison found herself stealing glances at Jake when she thought he wasn't looking. In the morning light, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, probably around her age. There were laugh lines around his eyes and a small scar on his chin that made her wonder what kind of adventures had put it there. Tommy's garage was exactly what she'd expected: organized chaos with car parts everywhere and classic rock playing from a radio that looked older than she was. Tommy himself was a bear of a man with grease-stained coveralls and a smile that lit up his whole face. "You're the lady with the fancy car," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yeah, she be fine. Just need to replace a radiator hose and top off the coolant. Give me a couple hours." Madison thanked him and turned to find Jake watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I guess I'll need that ride into town after all. Actually, I was heading into town anyway. Got some business to take care of at the bank." Something in his voice made her look at him more carefully, but his expression gave nothing away. They drove back toward the main street, and Madison realized this was her chance to get some information about her target. "So tell me about this town. How long has your family been here?" "My grandfather came here right after the war. Bought a piece of land that nobody else wanted and turned it into something special." Jake's voice carried a pride that was impossible to miss. "The Broken Arrow isn't the biggest ranch around, but it's home." Madison felt a little twist in her stomach that she didn't want to examine too closely. "Must be nice having that kind of history in one place." "Yeah, it is. Though these days keeping a family ranch going isn't as easy as it used to be." Jake glanced at her sideways. "Big corporations keep trying to buy up all the land around here, turn it into shopping centers or housing developments. That's progress, isn't it? Economic development creates jobs." Jake was quiet for a long moment. "I suppose that depends on what kind of jobs you're talking about, and what you have to destroy to create them." They pulled up in front of a small diner with a hand-painted sign that read Millie's Place. The parking lot was full of pickup trucks and a few cars that had seen better years. Through the windows, Madison could see the place was packed with people who all seemed to know each other. "Best breakfast in the county," Jake said, getting out of the truck. "Plus, if you want to know what's really going on in Cedar Ridge, this is where you come." Madison followed him inside, immediately aware that every conversation in the place had stopped and every eye was on her. She was clearly the outsider here, and her expensive suit made her stick out like a peacock in a chicken coop. "That's Jake Sullivan," she heard someone whisper. "Wonder who the city girl is." Jake led her to a booth in the back, and a waitress who looked like she'd been working there since the place opened came over with coffee and a smile that was friendly but curious. "Morning, Jake, honey. Who's your friend?" "This is Madison. She's visiting from Chicago." "Madison, this is Millie. She owns this place and knows everyone's business before they know it themselves." Millie laughed and poured their coffee. "Nice to meet you, dear. What brings you to our little town?" "Business?" Madison said, the same answer she'd given Jake yesterday. "What kind of business?" Millie pressed, clearly not satisfied with such a vague answer. Madison looked around the diner, taking in the faces watching their conversation with interest. This was it, the moment she'd been preparing for. Time to drop the bomb and see what happened. "I'm a lawyer. I represent a development company that's interested in purchasing some land in this area." The temperature in the room seemed to drop about 10 degrees. Jake set his coffee cup down carefully and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "What kind of development?" he asked quietly, Madison straightened her shoulders and switched into professional mode. A luxury resort and spa. My client believes this area has tremendous potential for high-end tourism. Mountain views, clean air, authentic Western experience. It would bring jobs and significant economic benefits to the community. And where exactly is this resort supposed to go? Jake's voice was still quiet, but there was something underneath it now that made Madison's instincts kick into high alert. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder with maps and property surveys. The ideal location would be the Broken Arrow Ranch. It has the perfect combination of size, location, and scenic value. The silence that followed was so complete that Madison could hear the old clock on the wall ticking. Jake stared at the papers in front of him like they were written in a foreign language. You want to buy my ranch? It wasn't a question. My client is prepared to make a very generous offer. Well above market value? Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it at all. Lady, you have no idea what you're talking about. I understand. This is emotional, but from a purely financial standpoint. Emotional? Jake's voice rose enough that other people in the diner turned to look. You think this is about emotions? Madison could feel the entire room watching them now, but she pressed on. This was what she did, pushed through resistance until she got what she wanted. Mr. Sullivan, I've done my research. Your ranch is struggling financially. You're behind on loan payments, and the agricultural market isn't exactly booming. My client's offer would solve all of those problems. And if I say no, Madison met his eyes directly, then we'll find other ways to acquire the property. Eminent domain, tax liens, environmental violations. There are always options when someone really wants a piece of land. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Jake leaned back in his seat and studied her face for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, but there was something dangerous underneath it. So you're threatening me. I'm explaining reality. This development is going to happen with or without your cooperation. The only question is whether you want to profit from it or fight a losing battle. Jake was quiet for another moment, then he started to smile. It wasn't the friendly smile she remembered from yesterday. This one was all teeth and no warmth. You know what, Madison? I'll be honest with you. When I picked you up on that road yesterday, I thought you were just another city person who'd gotten lost. Turns out you're something much more interesting. And what's that? You're the enemy. Jake's smile got wider. And lady, I want you to know something. You just declared war on the wrong cowboy. Madison felt her heart rate pick up, but she kept her expression neutral. This doesn't have to be a war. It can be a simple business transaction. Oh, it's going to be a war, Jake said, standing up from the booth. You want to threaten me? You want to take away everything my family built? Fine, but I want you to understand something. He leaned down so his face was close to hers, and Madison caught that same scent of leather and something essentially masculine that had distracted her in his truck. I'll ruin you, she said quietly, looking him straight in the eye. I'll use every legal tool I have to take your ranch, and when I'm done, you'll have nothing left but memories. Jake straightened up, and that dangerous smile got even wider. The entire diner was dead silent now, everyone straining to hear what would happen next. Then wreck me, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. I've been waiting for you. Madison felt something electric run through her at those words, something that had nothing to do with legal battles and everything to do with the way Jake was looking at her like she was a puzzle he intended to solve. You have no idea what you're up against, she said, standing up to face him. Neither do you, darlin', Jake replied, neither do you. He threw a $10 bill on the table and walked out of the diner. The next few days in Cedar Ridge were unlike anything Madison had ever experienced. She'd rented a small office space above the hardware store and turned it into her temporary war room. Legal documents covered every surface, her laptop never stopped humming, and she drank more coffee than was probably healthy for any human being. From her window, she could see the main street below, and she was starting to recognize the rhythm of small-town life. The same people walked by at the same times every day. The mailman, Pete, always stopped to chat with whoever was outside. Kids rode their bikes without helmets, something that would have given her a heart attack back in Chicago. What bothered her most was how often she found herself looking for Jake's truck among the vehicles parked along the street. She'd spent 3 days building her case against the Broken Arrow Ranch, and what she'd found surprised her. Jake hadn't been lying about the financial troubles. The ranch was definitely struggling. But as she dug deeper into the records, she discovered something else entirely. Jake Sullivan wasn't just some stubborn cowboy refusing to face reality. He was fighting to save something that mattered to a lot more people than just his family. The ranch employed 12 full-time workers, and twice that many during busy seasons. Jake had quietly helped 3 families avoid foreclosure by giving them work when other places wouldn't hire them. He donated beef to the food bank every year for the past 5 years, even when money was tight. The local high school's agriculture program used his land for teaching, and he'd never charged them a penny. Madison stared at the papers spread across her makeshift desk and tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling growing in her chest. This wasn't supposed to be complicated. It was supposed to be a simple acquisition: find the weak spots, apply pressure, close the deal, move on to the next case. But every person she'd talked to in town had a story about Jake Sullivan, and none of them were about some backwards rancher standing in the way of progress. Mrs. Chun at the grocery store told her how Jake had spent his own money to fix her delivery truck when she couldn't afford the repairs. The librarian mentioned that he'd built new bookshelves for the children's section and refused to take payment. Even Tommy at the garage, who was fixing her car, had stories about Jake helping stranded motorists without expecting anything in return. "That boy's got a heart bigger than this whole state," Tommy had said while replacing her radiator hose. "Shame someone's trying to take his home away from him." Madison had pretended not to hear the accusation in his voice. The worst part was that Jake seemed to be everywhere she went, but he never approached her or tried to interfere with her work. She'd see him at the diner in the mornings, always sitting at the same corner booth, reading the local paper and drinking coffee that Millie probably didn't charge him for. He'd nod politely if their eyes met, but that was it. It was driving her crazy. On Thursday afternoon, Madison was reviewing property tax records when the lights in her temporary office started flickering. She looked outside and saw dark clouds building over the mountains, moving fast toward town. The wind was picking up, rattling the old windows, and she could smell rain in the air. Her phone buzzed with a weather alert. Flash flood warning in effect. Seek higher ground immediately. Avoid low-lying areas and do not attempt to drive through standing water. Madison looked around her office and realized she had no idea what higher ground meant in a place like this. In Chicago, you went to a higher floor of a building. Here, she was already on the 2nd floor of what was probably the tallest building in town. The rain started as fat drops that splattered against the window, then quickly turned into a downpour that made it impossible to see across the street. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the lights flickered again before going out completely. Madison grabbed her phone and tried to call Rita at the motel, but she had no signal. The storm had knocked out the cell towers. She was trapped in a dark office above a hardware store with no way to communicate with anyone, and the rain was getting heavier by the minute. She gathered her important papers and stuffed them into her briefcase, and then carefully made her way downstairs. The hardware store was closed, but she could see water starting to pool in the street outside. The storm drains couldn't handle this much rain, this fast. Madison tried the door, but it was locked tight. She was stuck. That's when she heard the sound of an engine cutting through the noise of the storm. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see headlights approaching. A familiar pickup truck pulled up right in front of the building, and Jake Sullivan got out, not seeming to care that he was getting soaked instantly. He tried the door, found it locked, then looked up at the windows above. When he spotted Madison's face in the 2nd-floor window, he motioned for her to come down. "Door's locked," she shouted, not sure if he could hear her over the storm. Jake disappeared around the side of the building, and a few minutes later, Madison heard footsteps on the back stairs. He knocked on the office door she hadn't even known existed. "It's open," she called, and Jake stepped inside, dripping wet and looking like he'd just walked through a waterfall. "What are you doing here?" Madison asked, too relieved to see him, to worry about their ongoing legal battle. "Saw your light on when the storm hit. These flash floods can be dangerous if you don't know what you're dealing with." Jake ran a hand through his wet hair. "The street's going to flood in about 10 minutes. We need to get you out of here. I can't leave. All my work is here." Jake looked around the office, taking in the scattered papers and open laptop. "Your work won't matter much if you're stuck in a building surrounded by floodwater." As if to prove his point, lightning flashed outside, followed immediately by thunder that shook the windows. The rain was coming down so hard now that it sounded like someone was throwing gravel at the roof. "My car's at the motel," Madison said, feeling helpless in a way that was completely foreign to her. "My truck can handle the water, but we need to leave now." Jake was already moving toward her desk, unplugging her laptop and closing it. "What's the most important stuff?" Madison grabbed her briefcase and a few essential files. "This should be enough." Jake took her laptop and led her down the back stairs to where his truck was waiting. The water in the alley was already ankle-deep and rising fast. He helped her into the passenger seat, then climbed behind the wheel. "Where are we going?" Madison asked as Jake navigated carefully through the flooding streets. "My place? It's on higher ground, and the road to the motel is probably already washed out." Madison's heart skipped a beat. "Your place?" "I don't think that's appropriate, given our situation." Jake glanced at her, and in the dashboard lights, she could see he was almost smiling. "Lady, we're in the middle of a flash flood. Professional ethics take a back seat to not drowning." They drove in tense silence through the storm, Jake's truck pushing through water that would have swamped her rental car. Madison found herself gripping the door handle and trying not to think about what would have happened if Jake hadn't come for her. The Broken Arrow Ranch was beautiful, even in the storm. The main house sat on a hill overlooking the valley with large windows that glowed warmly in the darkness. Jake parked as close to the front door as possible and helped Madison make a run for it. Inside, the house was exactly what she'd expected. Comfortable furniture, family photos on the walls, and the kind of lived-in feeling that came from generations of people calling a place home. A fire was crackling in the stone fireplace, and the smell of something delicious was coming from the kitchen. "Smells like your grandmother's been cooking," Madison said, then immediately felt stupid for making such a personal comment. "Just me." "Actually, I was making dinner when I heard the weather warning and realized you might be stuck in town." Jake disappeared into what looked like a laundry room and came back with a towel and a warm flannel shirt. "You should get out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia." Madison looked down at her soaked suit and realized she was starting to shiver. "I don't think I should. There's a bathroom down the hall. The shirt will be way too big, but it's dry and warm." Jake's voice was gentle, with none of the tension that had been there since their confrontation at the diner. "I'll throw your clothes in the dryer." Madison took the shirt and towel, acutely aware that she was about to put on Jake Sullivan's clothes in Jake Sullivan's house while outside. The storm that had brought them together continued to rage. In the bathroom, she caught sight of herself. In the mirror, her perfect hair was a mess, her makeup was smudged, and her expensive suit looked like she'd been swimming in it. She looked nothing like the polished corporate Leia who'd arrived in Cedar Ridge a week ago. Jake's shirt hung almost to her knees and smelled like fabric softener and something that was purely him. When she emerged from the bathroom, Jake was stirring something on the stove and had changed into dry jeans and a sweater that made his shoulders look impossibly broad. "Feel better?" he asked without turning around. "Much, thank you." Madison stood awkwardly in the doorway, not sure what the protocol was for this situation. How long do these storms usually last? Could be a couple hours, could be all night. Depends on how the system moves through. Jake turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her pulse quicken. Madison woke up to the smell of bacon and the sound of birds singing outside her window. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The bed was softer than her hotel mattress, the room was filled with warm morning light, and she felt more rested than she had in weeks. Then reality came flooding back. She was at Jake's ranch, wearing his shirt. and she had approximately 12 hours to figure out what the night in his house meant for her mission. She could hear Jake moving around downstairs, probably making breakfast. The storm had passed sometime during the night, leaving behind crystal clear air and the kind of silence that only existed far from cities. Madison looked out the guest room window and saw the valley spread out below, green and beautiful in the morning sun. It was the kind of view that real estate developers dreamed about, and that made her stomach twist with guilt. Madison found her clothes folded neatly outside her door, warm from the dryer and smelling like fabric softener. She dressed quickly, trying to rebuild the professional armor that had somehow gotten stripped away the night before. Downstairs, Jake was at the stove wearing jeans and a t-shirt that showed off arms that definitely came from physical work. His hair was still messy from sleep, and he looked younger and more relaxed than she'd seen him before. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Hope you like eggs." "You don't have to cook for me," Madison said, suddenly feeling awkward about accepting his hospitality when she was still planning to take his home away from him. "Too late, already made them." Jake turned around with a plate in each hand. "Besides, my grandmother would come back from the dead and haunt me if I let a guest leave without breakfast." They ate on the front porch, watching the sun burn off the last of the storm clouds. Jake's dog, a border collie named Blue, lay at their feet, occasionally looking up hopefully for bacon scraps. "This is beautiful," Madison said, gesturing toward the view. She couldn't help herself. It really was stunning. "Best view in 3 counties, Jake agreed. "My great-grandfather chose this spot specifically for the sunrise," said a man should start every day looking at something that reminds him how lucky he is to be alive. Madison felt that guilt twist deeper. "Jake, about last night." "Don't worry about it," Jake said quickly. "What happens during a storm doesn't count in the real world. I know you're still here to take my ranch, and I'm still going to fight you every step of the way." But his tone was gentler than it had been before, and Madison caught him watching her with an expression that definitely hadn't been there a week ago. "I should get back to town," Madison said, standing up from the porch swing. "Thank you for everything." Jake drove her back to the motel in comfortable silence, but Madison spent the entire trip stealing glances at his hands on the steering wheel and remembering how it had felt when he touched her hand the night before, back in her temporary office. Madison tried to focus on her work, but her concentration kept wandering. Every time she looked at the contracts and property surveys, she found herself thinking about Jake's words from the night before, about small towns dying when the ranches disappeared, about people losing their way of life. She was still wrestling with these thoughts when her phone rang. The caller ID showed her boss, Richard, calling from the Chicago office. "Madison, I hope you have good news for me." Richard's voice was sharp and impatient. "The client is getting anxious about the timeline." "I'm making progress," Madison said, carefully, "but the situation is more complicated than we initially thought." "How complicated?" Madison took a deep breath. "Richard, I need to ask you something about this development project. What exactly is the client planning to build?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I already told you. A luxury resort and spa?" "Yes, but what else?" "There has to be more to justify this kind of investment in such a remote location." Another pause, longer this time. "Madison, your job is to acquire the property, not question the client's business plan." "I know, but I've been thinking about the environmental impact studies, and the environmental studies are being handled by other people. Focus on what you're being paid to do." Something in Richard's tone set off alarm bells in Madison's head. "Richard, is there something I should know about this project?" "Madison, you're overthinking this. It's a simple acquisition. Get it done." The line went dead, leaving Madison staring at her phone with a growing sense of unease. In 8 years of working for Richard, he'd never been evasive about project details. He'd never told her to stop asking questions. Madison opened her laptop and started digging deeper into her client's background. What she found made her blood run cold. The development company was a subsidiary of a larger corporation that specialized in natural resource extraction. They weren't planning to build a resort at all. They wanted the land for fracking hydraulic Fracturing to extract natural gas from underground rock formations, Madison sat back in her chair, feeling sick. Fracking would destroy the entire valley. The noise, the chemicals, the heavy truck traffic, the contaminated water, it would turn Jake's beautiful ranch and the surrounding area into an industrial wasteland, and she was helping them do it. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Client wants property secured within 72 hours. Use whatever legal pressure necessary. Madison stared at the message, her hands shaking slightly. She'd built her entire career on being ruthless, on winning at any cost, but this felt different. This felt wrong. She was still staring at her phone when she heard a commotion outside. Through her window, she could see an ambulance pulling up in front of the hardware store below. People were gathering on the sidewalk, and she could hear worried voices. Madison hurried downstairs to find out what was happening. Mrs. Chun from the grocery store was standing on the sidewalk, wringing her hands. "What's going on?" Madison asked. "It's Jake's grandfather," Mrs. Chun said, tears in her eyes. "Henry Sullivan. He collapsed at home this morning. They're taking him to the hospital." Madison felt her heart drop into her stomach. "Is he going to be okay?" "Nobody knows yet. He's 87 years old and his heart's been weak for years." Mrs. Chun shook her head. "That boy Jake has been taking care of him and the ranch all by himself. If something happens to Henry..." She didn't finish the sentence, but Madison could fill in the blanks. If Jake's grandfather died, Jake would be completely alone, trying to save a failing ranch while dealing with grief and the legal pressure Madison was about to unleash on him. Madison found herself walking toward her rental car without really deciding to. 20 minutes later, she was standing in the waiting room of the small county hospital, not entirely sure why she was there. Jake was sitting in a plastic chair, still wearing the same clothes from breakfast, his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard footsteps and seemed surprised to see her. "Madison, what are you doing here? I heard about your grandfather." "I'm sorry," Jake nodded, then looked back down at his hands. "He's stable for now, but the doctor says his heart is pretty weak, could go either way." Madison sat down in the chair next to him, not caring that it was probably inappropriate. "Is there anything I can do?" Jake looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Why would you want to help me? I'm just a guy standing between you and your commission." The words hit Madison like a slap. Was that really how Jake saw her? As someone who only cared about money and winning cases? That's not... Madison started, then stopped, because wasn't that exactly what she was? "Jake, there's something I need to tell you about the development project. Now's not really the time for business discussions." "This isn't business. This is personal." Madison took a deep breath. "They're not building a resort. They want your land for fracking. Natural gas extraction." Jake's head snapped up and Madison saw shock and anger flash across his face. "What? I just found out today? My boss lied to me about the real purpose of the development. If they get your land, they'll destroy the entire valley." Jake stared at her for a long moment. "And you're telling me this why?" "Because it's wrong. Because what they're planning would hurt everyone who lives here." Madison felt tears threatening. "Because spending time with you has made me remember that there are things more important than winning." Before Jake could respond, a doctor in scrubs appeared in the waiting room doorway. "Jake Sullivan?" Jake jumped up. "That's me. How is he?" "Your grandfather is stable, but he's had a significant heart attack. We've got him on medications to help his heart function, but at his age, recovery is going to be slow and uncertain." "Can I see him?" "He's sleeping right now, but you can sit with him if you'd like. He'll probably be in and out of consciousness for the next day or two." Jake nodded and started to follow the doctor, then turned back to Madison. "Thank you for telling me about the fracking. I know that probably wasn't easy." Madison watched him disappear down the hospital corridor, then sat back down in the uncomfortable plastic chair. Her phone was buzzing with messages from Richard, probably demanding updates on her progress. She ignored them all. Instead, she called her assistant back in Chicago and asked her to overnight a box of files, every environmental law textbook Madison owned, plus research on fracking regulations and citizens' rights cases, If her client wanted a legal fight, Madison was going to give them one. But not the kind they were expecting. Madison hadn't slept properly in 3 days. Her temporary office looked like a hurricane had hit it, law books stacked everywhere, empty coffee cups on every surface, and papers covering the floor in organized chaos that only she could understand. She'd been building a case against her own client, and it was the hardest legal work she'd ever done. Jake's grandfather was recovering slowly at the hospital, conscious now but weak. Jake had been splitting his time between ranch work and sitting by Henry's bedside, and Madison could see the exhaustion wearing on him. Dark circles under his eyes, shoulders that carried too much weight, hands that shook slightly when he thought no one was looking. Madison's phone had been ringing constantly. For 2 days. Richard calling from Chicago, getting angrier with each unanswered call. She'd finally turned it off completely and focused on what mattered, finding a way to stop the fracking project before it destroyed everything. That's when Richard showed up in person. Madison was reviewing water quality reports when she heard footsteps on the stairs leading to her office. Heavy, expensive shoes on old wooden steps. She knew that sound. Richard always wore Italian leather, no matter where he was going. Madison. Richard appeared in her doorway, looking perfectly pressed, despite the long flight from Chicago. His gray suit didn't have a wrinkle, his silver hair was perfectly styled, and his cold blue eyes took in her chaotic office with obvious disapproval. Richard. Madison stood up, suddenly aware of how she must look. Her hair was in a messy ponytail. She was wearing jeans and a sweater instead of her usual suits, and she probably had ink stains on her fingers from taking notes. What the hell is going on here? Richard stepped into the office, carefully avoiding the papers on the floor. You've missed every deadline, ignored my calls, and our client is threatening to find new representation. I've been investigating the environmental impact of the project, Madison said carefully. There are some serious legal issues that need to be addressed. Richard's expression didn't change. Such as the fact that you lied to me about what we're actually building here. Madison's voice was steady, but inside she was terrified. Richard had been her mentor for 8 years. He taught her everything she knew about corporate law, and crossing him meant ending her career. I told you what you needed to know to do your job. My job was supposed to be acquiring land for a resort development, not helping a fracking company destroy an entire valley. Richard sighed and sat down in the only chair not covered with papers. Madison, you're being naive. Do you have any idea how much money is at stake here? The natural gas reserves under this valley are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And what about the people who live here? What about the environmental damage? What about them? Richard's voice was cold. This is business, not charity work. Our job is to represent our clients' interests, not save the world. Madison felt something hot and angry rise in her chest. Is that really what you think? That none of this matters except the money? That's exactly what I think. And it's what you used to think, too, before you let some cowboy turn your head around. The mention of Jake made Madison's cheeks burn. This has nothing to do with Jake Sullivan. Richard smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Doesn't it? You've been here 2 weeks, Madison. 2 weeks in the middle of nowhere with a man who's probably never met a woman like you. I can see why. You might be ... confused. I'm not confused. I'm doing what's right. What's right is completing the acquisition and getting back to Chicago where you belong. Richard stood up and straightened his tie. I'm giving you 48 hours, Madison. Get the Sullivan property secured, or I'll have someone else finish the job, and if I refuse, then you're fired. And I'll make sure every major law firm in the country knows that Madison Cross can't be trusted to put her clients' interests first. Richard's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather. You'll never work in corporate law again. Madison felt the walls closing in around her. 8 years of building her career, 8 years of climbing the ladder, and it could all disappear in 48 hours. I need time to think, she said quietly. You have 48 hours to think. Use them wisely. Richard headed for the door, then turned back. Oh, and Madison? Stay away from Sullivan. I've already put certain legal processes in motion that will make his life very difficult if he continues to resist. You wouldn't want him to get hurt because of your friendship." After Richard left, Madison sank into her chair and put her head in her hands. She'd known this moment would come, but she hadn't expected it to feel like having her heart ripped out. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Grandfather's asking for you. Can you come to the hospital?" Madison grabbed her jacket and drove to the hospital, trying to figure out what she was going to tell Jake about Richard's visit. How could she explain that helping him might have made everything worse? Henry Sullivan was awake when Madison arrived, sitting up in bed and looking more alert than she'd seen him since the heart attack. His eyes were the same warm brown as Jake's, and when he smiled she could see where Jake got his easy charm. "So you're the famous Madison Cross," Henry said, his voice weak but cheerful. "Jake's told me all about you." Madison glanced at Jake, who was sitting beside the bed looking embarrassed. "I hope he said good things. He said you're the smartest person he's ever met." "And the most stubborn?" Henry's eyes twinkled. "Sounds like a perfect match for our Jake." "Grandpa," Jake warned, but he was almost smiling. "What?" "I'm old and I just had a heart attack. I can say whatever I want." Henry reached out and took Madison's hand with fingers that were thin but surprisingly strong. "Jake also told me you're trying to help us save the ranch." Madison felt her throat tighten. "I'm trying, but it's more complicated than I thought." "Most things worth doing are complicated," Henry said gently. "The question is whether you think it's worth the fight." Madison looked at Jake, who was watching her with an expression that made her heart race. "Yes," she said quietly, "I think it's worth the fight." Henry squeezed her hand. "Then don't give up. This old ranch has survived droughts, floods, economic crashes, and 3 generations of stubborn Sullivan men. It's not going down without a fight." A nurse came in to check Henry's medications, and Jake walked Madison out to the parking lot. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that took her breath away. "Thank you for coming," Jake said. "He's been asking about you since yesterday." "Jake, there's something I need to tell you." Madison took a deep breath. "My boss came to see me today. He's giving me 48 hours to complete the acquisition or I'm fired." Jake stopped walking. "What does that mean?" "It means they're going to escalate their legal pressure on you. It means they might try to force you out through other methods." Madison felt tears threatening. "It means I might have made everything worse by trying to help." Jake turned to face her fully. "Madison, look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, expecting to see anger or disappointment. Instead, she saw something that made her knees weak. "Do you regret it?" Jake asked quietly. "Trying to help me?" "No," Madison said without hesitation. "Even if it cost me everything, I don't regret it." Jake stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Good, because I don't regret meeting you either, even though I came here to take your home away. Especially because of that." Jake reached up and touched her cheek gently. "You could have just done your job and left. But you didn't. You chose to fight for something that matters, even when it was hard." Madison felt herself leaning into his touch. "Jake, I don't know what happens next. I don't know if I can stop them." "Then we'll figure it out together." Before Madison could think about all the reasons it was a bad idea, Jake leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, like he was asking permission. When Madison kissed him back, it became something deeper, more desperate, like they both knew they might be running out of time when they finally broke apart. Madison was breathing hard and feeling dizzy. "That probably wasn't smart," she said. "Probably not," Jake agreed. "But I've been wanting to do that since the night of the storm. Jake, if we do this, if we there's no going back. Richard will destroy my career if he finds out." "Is your career more important than this?" Jake gestured between them. "Than what we could have." Madison thought about her corner office in Chicago, her carefully planned life, her 6-figure salary. Then she looked at Jake, standing in a hospital parking lot in the middle of Montana, offering her something she'd never thought she wanted. "No," she said quietly, "it's not more important." Jake smiled. the real smile that had been missing since their confrontation at the diner. "Then let's go home. Your home or mine?" "Mine, definitely mine." They drove to the Broken Arrow Ranch. In Jake's truck, holding hands across the center console, Madison's rental car could wait until tomorrow. Tonight, she just wanted to be with Jake, to forget about deadlines and legal threats and career consequences. At the ranch, Jake built a fire while Madison made coffee. They sat on his couch, her feet tucked under her, his arm around her shoulders, and talked about everything except the legal battle waiting for them. Jake told her about growing up on the ranch. Madison woke up before dawn on Jake's couch, her neck stiff from sleeping in an awkward position, but her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. Jake was still asleep beside her, one arm draped protectively around her shoulders, his face peaceful in the early morning light filtering through the windows. For a moment, Madison let herself imagine what it would be like to wake up like this every morning. To have coffee on the front porch watching the sunrise, to help with ranch work, to be part of something bigger than quarterly profits and billable hours. Then reality crashed back in. She had less than 24 hours left on Richard's ultimatum. Madison carefully slipped out from under Jake's arm and went to the kitchen to make coffee. Through the window, she could see the sun starting to paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. It was beautiful enough to make her chest ache with the thought of losing it. Her phone, which she'd finally turned back on, showed 17 missed calls from Richard and a series of increasingly threatening text messages. The last one, sent at midnight, made her blood run cold. "Since you won't answer, I'll handle Sullivan myself. Eminent domain proceedings begin this morning." Madison's hands started shaking. Eminent domain meant the government could seize private property for public use, usually with compensation, but without the owner's consent. If Richard had convinced local officials that the fracking project served the public interest, Jake could lose his ranch regardless of what Madison did. "You're up early." Jake appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair messy and his shirt wrinkled from sleeping on the couch. Even rumpled and half awake, he made Madison's heart skip. "I couldn't sleep." Madison handed him a cup of coffee, trying to keep her voice steady. "Jake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Jake's expression grew serious. "Okay, if you lose the ranch, what will you do?" "Where will you go?" Jake stared at her for a long moment. "Why are you asking me that?" Madison took a deep breath. "Because Richard sent me a message last night. They're starting eminent domain proceedings this morning." The coffee cup slipped from Jake's hands and shattered on the kitchen floor, but he didn't seem to notice. "What does that mean?" "It means they're claiming that taking your property serves the public good. If they can prove that to a judge, they can force you to sell, even if you don't want to." Jake leaned against the kitchen counter like he needed the support. "How long do I have?" "I don't know. Could be weeks, could be months. But Jake... Madison's voice broke. "I don't think I can stop it, not from the outside." They cleaned up the broken coffee cup in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Madison knew what she had to do, but she was terrified of the consequences. Not just for her career, but for Jake and everyone else in Cedar Ridge. "I have to go back to town," Madison said finally. "There are some things I need to take care of." Jake caught her hand as she headed for the door. "Madison, whatever you're thinking of doing, we can find another way." Madison looked into his eyes and saw everything she'd never known she wanted. Some fights can only be won from the inside. Back at her office, Madison spent 2 hours organizing every piece of evidence she'd gathered about the fracking project. Environmental impact studies that had been falsified. Water quality reports that had been buried. Safety violations at other fracking sites that her client had been involved with. It was enough to destroy the project. It was also enough to destroy her. At exactly 10 o'clock, Madison walked into the Cedar Ridge courthouse, a file folder under her arm and her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Richard was already there, along with 2 other lawyers Madison didn't recognize and a man in an expensive suit who was probably the client. They were sitting at a conference table with Judge Harrison, a gray-haired woman who'd been handling county legal matters for 20 years. "Madison," Richard said when he saw her. Good, I was beginning to think you decided to skip our little meeting. I wouldn't miss it for the world, Madison replied. Taking a seat across from them, Judge Harrison looked tired and annoyed. Mr. Peterson, you're claiming that this natural gas extraction project qualifies for eminent domain under public benefit statutes. That's a significant legal step, and I'm not inclined to approve it without substantial justification. Richard opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Your Honor, this project will bring hundreds of jobs to the county and millions of dollars in tax revenue. The economic benefit to the community is undeniable. What about the environmental impact? Judge Harrison asked. Minimal, the client said smoothly. We've conducted extensive studies and modern fracking techniques are completely safe. Madison felt her moment arriving. Your Honor, I'd like to submit some additional evidence for your consideration. Richard's head snapped around. Madison, what are you doing? Madison stood up and walked to the judge's desk, her legs somehow steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. I'm representing the public interest, Your Honor, and the public has a right to know what they're really getting. She opened her file folder and spread the documents across the judge's desk. These are the real environmental impact studies. The ones showing that fracking in this valley would contaminate the groundwater for 3 counties. These are safety reports from other sites showing a pattern of accidents and violations. And this is evidence that my client has been deliberately hiding these risks from local authorities. The silence in the room was deafening. Madison could feel Richard's fury radiating across the table, but she kept her eyes on Judge Harrison, who was examining the documents with growing alarm. Mr. Peterson, Judge Harrison said slowly, can you explain why none of this information was included in your initial filing? Richard's face had gone pale. Your Honor, I'm not sure where Miss Cross obtained these documents, but I obtained them from our client's own files, Madison said clearly. Files that should have been disclosed as part of the legal requirement for environmental review. The client, who had been silent until now, suddenly stood up. Your Honor, we were not aware that our counsel had access to preliminary documents that may not have been finalized. These aren't preliminary, Madison interrupted. They're final reports that were buried because they didn't support the narrative you wanted to present. Judge Harrison held up her hand for silence. I'm going to need time to review all of this evidence, Mr. Peterson. I'm postponing this hearing indefinitely pending a full investigation into these environmental claims. Your Honor, Richard said desperately, surely we can— The hearing is postponed, Judge Harrison said firmly. And, Mr. Peterson, I suggest you and your client review your ethical obligations regarding disclosure of material evidence. As soon as they left the courthouse, Richard grabbed Madison's arm hard enough to bruise. What the hell do you think you're doing? Madison pulled free. My job, protecting the public interest. Your job is representing our client. Not when our client is breaking the law. Madison's voice was steady, but inside she was shaking. Not when people could get hurt. Richard's face was red with anger. You're finished, Madison, not just at our firm, everywhere. I'll make sure every law firm in the country knows that Madison Cross can't be trusted. Then I guess I'll have to find a different kind of law to practice. Madison walked away, leaving Richard standing on the courthouse steps. Her phone was already ringing. Probably the client, probably other lawyers from the firm, probably reporters, who had somehow gotten wind of the story. She ignored them all and drove straight to the hospital. Jake was in the waiting room, looking like he'd aged 10 years since morning. When he saw Madison, he jumped up. How did it go? The eminent domain hearing has been postponed indefinitely, Madison said. The fracking project is probably dead. Jake's face lit up with hope. Really? You stopped them? For now. But Jake, there's something else. Madison took his hands in hers. I just destroyed my career. Richard's going to make sure I never work in corporate law again. Jake's expression grew serious. Are you okay with that? Madison thought about her corner office, her 6-figure salary, her carefully planned life that had felt more like a prison than freedom. Yes, I think I am. Jake pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. I'm proud of you. even though I might be unemployed and potentially facing legal consequences for what I just did, especially because of that. Jake pulled back to look at her face. Madison, what you did took more courage than I've ever seen from anyone. Before Madison could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. Miss Cross? This is Detective Williams with the State Attorney General's office. We understand you have information about environmental fraud in the Cedar Ridge case. We'd like to schedule an interview. Madison looked at Jake, who was watching her with pride and love in his eyes. Yes, she said into the phone. I have information you need to hear. That evening, Madison and Jake sat on his front porch watching the sunset over the valley that was safe, at least for now. Madison's phone had finally stopped ringing after she'd given her statement to 3 different law enforcement agencies. So, what happens next? Jake asked. Criminal investigation, probably. Civil lawsuits, definitely. Richard and the client are in serious trouble. Madison leaned against Jake's shoulder. Madison thought her troubles were over after exposing the fracking scheme, but she was wrong. Dead wrong. 3 days after the courthouse confrontation, she woke up to the sound of car doors slamming outside Jake's ranch house, through the bedroom window. She could see 2 police cars and several men in suits walking toward the front door. Jake, Madison shook him awake. There are police here. Jake sat up instantly, the kind of alertness that came from years of ranch life where emergencies could happen at any time. What do they want? Before Madison could answer, there was a heavy knock on the front door. Jake pulled on jeans and a shirt while Madison grabbed a robe, her heart pounding with a terrible certainty that this wasn't a social visit. Sheriff Collins was standing on the porch with 2 state troopers and a man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd driven straight from Chicago. Madison recognized the type immediately. Corporate lawyer, probably someone Richard had sent to clean up the mess she'd created. Jake Sullivan? Sheriff Collins looked uncomfortable, like he'd rather be anywhere else. I have a warrant for the arrest of Madison Cross. Madison felt the blood drain from her face. On what charges? The man in the suit stepped forward. Corporate espionage, theft of proprietary documents, and violation of attorney-client privilege. Ms. Cross, you have the right to remain silent. Wait, just a minute, Jake stepped protectively in front of Madison. What evidence do you have that she did anything wrong? She stole confidential documents from her law firm and used them to interfere with a legitimate business transaction. The suit said smoothly, That's theft and industrial sabotage. Madison's mind was racing. Richard had found a way to turn her ethical stand into criminal charges. It was brilliant and evil at the same time. I need to call a lawyer, Madison said. Quietly. You are a lawyer, one of the state troopers pointed out. I need to call a different lawyer, someone who specializes in criminal defense. But as they put handcuffs on Madison and led her to the police car, she realized she didn't actually know any criminal defense attorneys. Corporate law was a completely different world from criminal defense, and she was about to find out just how different. Jake followed the police cars to the county jail, where Madison was processed and held pending a bail hearing. The whole experience was surreal, being fingerprinted, photographed, and locked in a cell like a common criminal when just a week ago she'd been a respected attorney with a corner office. The bail hearing was a nightmare. The prosecutor, clearly influenced by whoever was pulling the strings behind the scenes, argued that Madison was a flight risk who had already demonstrated a willingness to betray her professional obligations. Your Honor, the prosecutor said, the defendant has destroyed her career and has no ties to this community. There's nothing to prevent her from fleeing to avoid prosecution. Madison's court-appointed attorney was a young public defender who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He mumbled something about Madison's previously clean record, but it was clear he was outmatched by the team of expensive lawyers Richard had assembled. Judge Harrison, the same judge who had postponed the eminent domain hearing, set bail at $50,000, an amount that might as well have been $50 million for someone who had just lost her job and had no family money to fall back on. Madison was led back to her cell, trying not to think about how everything had fallen apart so quickly. She'd done the right thing. But apparently doing the right thing sometimes came with a very high price. That evening, a guard came to tell her she had a visitor. Madison expected to see Jake, but instead found herself sitting across from Henry Sullivan, Jake's grandfather, who had somehow managed to get himself discharged from the hospital to come see her. "Mr. Sullivan, you should be resting," Madison said, shocked to see him out of his hospital bed. "I'll rest when I'm dead," Henry replied with a grin that reminded her exactly of Jake. "Right now, I'm here to talk business. I don't understand." Henry pulled out a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "This is the deed to the North Pasture. 40 acres of the prettiest land you ever saw, with a creek running through it and a view of the mountains that'll take your breath away." Madison stared at the document. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I'm using it as collateral for your bail. Judge Harrison has agreed to accept property as security instead of cash." Madison felt tears spring to her eyes. "Mr. Sullivan, you can't do that. If I run, you'll lose your land." "Where exactly are you planning to run to?" Henry asked with a chuckle. "You got no money, no job, and nowhere to go except right here where you belong." "But what if the case goes badly? What if I'm convicted?" Henry leaned forward and took her hands in his weathered ones. "Girl, my family has been fighting to keep this land for 3 generations. We've survived droughts, floods, economic crashes, and every other disaster you can think of. You think we're afraid of some fancy lawyers from Chicago?" Madison was crying now, overwhelmed by the kindness of this family who barely knew her but was willing to risk everything to help her. "Besides," Henry continued, "Jake would never forgive me if I let his future wife sit in jail over some trumped-up charges." "His what?" Madison wiped her eyes, startled. "Oh, he hasn't asked you yet?" "Well, don't tell him I spoiled the surprise." Henry winked. "That boy's been carrying around his grandmother's engagement ring for the past week, working up the courage to pop the question." 2 hours later, Madison was free on bail and back at the ranch where Jake was waiting on the front porch with Blue at his feet. He pulled her into his arms the moment she got out of Henry's truck. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, holding her tight. "Your grandfather just risked 40 acres of his land to get me out of jail," Madison said against his chest. "I'm terrified and grateful and completely overwhelmed." "That's Grandpa for you. He doesn't do anything halfway." That night, Madison and Jake sat at his kitchen table surrounded by law books and legal documents, trying to figure out how to fight the charges against her. Madison's court-appointed attorney had already suggested a plea bargain, but pleading guilty to theft charges would mean losing her law license permanently. "There has to be something we can use," Jake said, flipping through a book on criminal procedure. "Some precedent or loophole or something?" Madison was staring at the original environmental reports she'd obtained from Richard's files. "Jake, I've been thinking about this all wrong." "What do you mean?" "These documents weren't stolen. They were evidence of a crime." Madison's voice got excited as the idea took shape. "Under whistleblower protection laws exposing corporate fraud. Isn't theft? It's a legal obligation?" Jake looked up from his book. "Can you prove that?" "Maybe, if I can show that Richard and the client knew about the environmental dangers and deliberately hid them, then revealing that information was protecting the public, not committing a crime." Madison spent the next 3 days building her defense while also helping Jake with ranch work. Feeding cattle, mending fences, and mucking out stalls turned out to be surprisingly therapeutic after years of sitting behind a desk. More importantly, she was getting to see what her life could be like in Cedar Ridge. The physical work felt good, the mountain air cleared her head, and every evening ended with sitting on the porch with Jake, watching the sunset and planning their future. The breakthrough came when Madison was researching similar cases and found a precedent from Colorado. A lawyer who had exposed environmental fraud by an oil company had been initially charged with theft, but the charges were dropped when the court ruled that disclosure of information that prevented public harm was protected speech. "This is it," Madison told Jake, waving the case file. "This is exactly what happened to me. The environmental fraud, the cover-up, even the retaliation charges. What happened to the lawyer in Colorado?" The charges were dismissed, and he ended up winning a wrongful termination lawsuit against his firm. Madison grinned. He used the settlement money to start his own practice representing environmental groups. Jake kissed her, tasting like coffee and possibility. So we fight? We fight. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week, and Madison spent every waking hour preparing her defense. She had evidence, precedent, and most importantly, she had the truth on her side. But on the morning of the hearing, Madison woke up to find Jake standing at the kitchen window with a grim expression on his face. "What's wrong?" she asked. Jake handed her the local newspaper. The front page headline read, "Environmental lawyer facing charges while fracking. Company finds new route to Broken Arrow Ranch." Madison's heart sank as she read the article. While she'd been focused on fighting the criminal charges, Richard and his client had been working on a new strategy. They'd found a legal loophole that would allow them to claim eminent domain through a different county, bypassing Judge Harrison entirely. "How long do we have?" Madison asked. "According to this, the new hearing is scheduled for next week." Same time as your criminal trial. Madison looked at Jake, seeing her own determination reflected in his eyes. They were fighting a war on two fronts now, but they weren't fighting alone. "Then we better get to work," Madison said, already reaching for her phone to call every environmental lawyer, ranchers' rights advocate, and community organizer she could think of. The courthouse was packed on the morning of Madison's criminal trial. Word had spread throughout Cedar Ridge and the surrounding counties about the lawyer who had risked everything to stop the fracking project. Ranchers, business owners, and ordinary citizens filled every seat, many holding signs that read "Support Madison Cross" and "Protect Our Water." Madison sat at the defendant's table wearing her best remaining suit, trying to look confident despite the butterflies in her stomach. Jake was in the front row directly behind her, and every time she looked back at him, he gave her an encouraging smile that made her feel like she could conquer the world. Her new attorney, Patricia Wells, was a tough environmental lawyer from Denver who had driven all night to take Madison's case. Unlike the overwhelmed public defender, Patricia looked like she could eat Richard's legal team for breakfast and ask for seconds. "Remember," Patricia whispered as the judge entered the courtroom, "we're not just defending you. We're setting a precedent for every lawyer who wants to do the right thing." Judge Martinez called the court to order, and the prosecutor began his opening statement. He painted Madison as a rogue lawyer who had betrayed her client's trust and stolen confidential documents for personal gain. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor said, "this case is about trust. Ms. Cross violated the most sacred principle of our legal system, the attorney-client privilege. She cannot claim to be a hero when she broke the very rules that make our justice system work." When Patricia stood up for Madison's defense, the energy in the room shifted. She was calm, confident, and absolutely fearless. "This case is not about attorney-client privilege," Patricia began. "This case is about whether lawyers have a duty to protect the public when their clients are planning to poison entire communities." Ms. Cross didn't steal documents. She preserved evidence of environmental crimes. That would have affected thousands of innocent people. Patricia laid out the evidence methodically. The falsified environmental reports, the hidden safety violations, the deliberate plan to conceal the true nature of the fracking project from local authorities. With each piece of evidence, the prosecutor's case looked weaker and weaker. The key moment came when Patricia called Dr. Jennifer Hayes, an environmental scientist from the State University, to testify about the potential impact of fracking in the Cedar Ridge Valley. "Dr. Hayes," Patricia asked, "in your professional opinion, what would have happened if this fracking project had proceeded as planned?" Dr. Hayes looked directly at the jury. "It would have been an environmental disaster. The geological surveys show that fracking in this location would have contaminated groundwater for 3 counties. We're talking about poisoned wells, dead livestock, and health problems for thousands of people. And would the public have known about these risks without Ms. Cross's disclosure of the suppressed reports? Absolutely not. The company's public filings contain none of this information." During cross-examination, the prosecutor tried to discredit Dr. Hayes, but she held her ground. Every answer she gave made it clear that Madison had prevented a catastrophe. When it was Madison's turn to testify, she walked to the witness stand feeling the weight of everyone's expectations. This was her chance to explain why she had risked everything. "Miss Cross," Patricia said gently, "can you tell the jury why you decided to reveal the environmental reports?" Madison looked out at the packed courtroom, seeing faces of people who had become her neighbors and friends. "I became a lawyer because I believed in justice. I thought that meant winning cases and making money. But when I saw what would happen to this valley, to these people, I realized that real justice sometimes means standing up to the powerful, even when it costs you everything. Did you know you would face criminal charges when you made that decision?" "I knew there would be consequences. But I also knew that I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent while an entire community was poisoned for profit." The prosecutor's cross-examination was aggressive, but Madison held her ground. Yes, she had violated attorney-client privilege. Yes, she had known it was against firm policy, but no, she didn't regret it. "Miss Cross," the prosecutor said during his final question, "do you think lawyers should be allowed to break the rules whenever they disagree with their clients?" Madison thought carefully before answering. "I think lawyers should remember that we have a higher duty than just serving our clients. We have a duty to justice itself." Closing arguments took most of the afternoon. The prosecutor stuck to his theme about trust and professional ethics. Patricia made an impassioned plea about moral courage and the difference between legal technicalities and true justice. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patricia concluded, "Madison Cross had a choice. She could follow the rules and let thousands of people suffer, or she could break an unjust rule to prevent a greater injustice. I ask you, which choice would you have made?" The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Madison spent that time in a conference room with Jake and Henry, trying not to think about what would happen if she was convicted. Prison time was possible, though unlikely for a first offense. But even a misdemeanor conviction would end her legal career permanently. "Whatever happens," Jake said, holding her hand, "we'll figure it out together." Madison squeezed his fingers. "Promise me something. If I'm convicted, if I lose my license, don't let that stop you from living your life. Don't let this ruin your future." "Madison," Jake said seriously, "you are my future. License or no license, conviction or no conviction, I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Before Madison could respond, the bailiff appeared in the doorway. The juries reached a verdict. Walking back into the packed courtroom felt like the longest journey of Madison's life. The jury foreman stood up, holding a piece of paper that contained her entire future. "On the charge of corporate espionage, we find the defendant not guilty." Madison's knees nearly buckled with relief, but the foreman wasn't finished. "On the charge of theft of proprietary documents, we find the defendant not guilty." The courtroom erupted in cheers. People were hugging, crying, and applauding. Madison felt Jake's arms around her from behind, holding her steady as relief flooded through her. Judge Martinez banged his gavel for order. "Miss Cross, you are free to go." The court also notes that this case raises important questions about the balance between professional obligations and public welfare that deserve further consideration by the State Bar Association. Outside the courthouse, Madison was surrounded by reporters, supporters, and well-wishers. She gave a brief statement thanking the jury and promising to continue fighting for environmental protection, then escaped to Jake's truck. "I can't believe it's over," Madison said as they drove back toward the ranch. "It's not over yet," Jake reminded her. "We still have to deal with the new eminent domain case." Madison had almost forgotten about the other legal threat to the ranch. While she'd been fighting criminal charges, Richard and his client had been pursuing their backup plan through a different county, but when they arrived at the ranch, Henry was waiting on the porch with a huge grin and a stack of papers in his hands. "What's all that?" Jake asked. "These," Henry said proudly, "are the original land grant documents from 1952. I found them in your grandmother's old cedar chest this morning." Madison examined the yellowed papers carefully. "Henry, these Show that the mineral rights were never transferred when your family bought the land. You own everything above and below ground. Which means? Jake asked. Which means they can't drill for natural gas here, even if they somehow get the surface rights through eminent domain. Without mineral rights, the fracking project is impossible. Henry's grin got even wider. Funny how important papers have a way of showing up just when you need them most. 3 months later, Madison stood in the office of her new law practice on Cedar Ridge's Main Street. The sign outside read Cross-Environmental Law, Protecting Communities, Preserving Futures. Her first clients were a group of ranchers from the next county who were facing a similar threat from another energy company. The criminal case had attracted national attention, leading to new whistleblower protections for lawyers who exposed environmental crimes. Madison had been invited to speak at law schools and environmental conferences across the country. Several major law firms had tried to recruit her, offering huge salaries and corner offices. She'd turned them all down. You know, Jake said, appearing in her office doorway with 2 cups of coffee and blue at his heels, when I first met you, I never imagined you as a small-town lawyer. When you first met me, I was stranded on the side of the road in designer heels, Madison replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. I've learned a few things since then. Such as? Madison looked out her window at the main street of Cedar Ridge, where she could see people she now knew by name going about their daily lives. Mrs. Chun was arranging vegetables outside her grocery store. Tommy was working on someone's car with the garage doors open. Kids were riding their bikes without helmets, just like they had the first day she'd arrived. Such is the difference between being successful and being happy, Madison said, between winning and doing what's right, between having a career and having a life worth living. Jake sat on the edge of her desk. Any regrets? Madison thought about her old life in Chicago.